James A. Garfield was a lawyer, Major General in the Union Army, an Ohio Senator, and Ohio Congressman who went on to win the 1880 U.S. presidential election to become the 20th President of the United States. He could also write with both his left and right hands, which is pretty cool, so he is possibly the most intelligent American president to have held the office. However, his time as president would only last about 6 months. On July 2, 1881, Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau, who was a deluded schizophrenic office seeker who thought that Garfield should have rewarded him with a place in his administration because this idiot thought that he had single-handedly been responsible for Garfield winning the 1880 election. Garfield died on September 19th due to an infection caused by the doctor's unsanitary methods in treating his wounds. According to some historians and medical experts, Garfield might have survived his wounds had the doctors attending him had used proper medical research knowledge, techniques, and equipment. Standard medical practice at the time dictated that priority be given to locating the path to the bullet, and several of his doctors inserted their unsanitary fingers into the wound to probe for the bullet, a pretty common practice in the 1880s. Historians agree that the massive infection was a significant factor in Garfield's death, and the doctors were kinda just idiots. Regardless of whether or not Garfield could have been saved had 1880s doctors not been so disgusting, changes to occur in an alternate timeline so that Garfield lives would be if James G. Blaine went with Garfield and his entire cabinet on a train. It was because Blaine was staying in Washington that Garfield remained outside the train to talk with Blaine for so long in deep conversation that Guiteau came close enough to shoot the president while he was talking. With Garfield alive in this alternate timeline, what's his time in office gonna be like? Well, to start, we can look at what plans Garfield had for his administration, stuff that he actually did during his time in office, and things that Arthur did. By looking at Vice President Arthur, we can see how Garfield would have reacted differently because Arthur really wasn't the best president on certain matters. Domestically, Garfield had called for many civil service reforms, as well as sharp increases in civil rights protections, which is something that his vice president and successor, Chester A. Arthur, didn't feel too strongly about. With that, I'd say that Garfield's administration would increase civil rights in the early 1880s, but some of his other ideas, like universal education, probably wouldn't work out. Additionally, with Garfield in office during his full term, he would not sign the Chinese Exclusionary Act as President Arthur did in our timeline. Effects of this would see the US and China still be on alright terms instead of tanking to immediate hostility because Arthur was okay with blaming Chinese immigrants and workers for causing economic problems in California. Garfield, on the other hand, definitely wouldn't cave to Californian residents wanting to blame immigrants for all of their problems. On the economy, during his brief time in office, Garfield ordered Treasury Secretary William Windom to refund or refinance the national debt by calling an outstanding U.S. bonds paying 6% interest. Holders would have the option of accepting cash or new bonds at 3%, closer to the interest rates of the time, and taxpayers were saved an estimated $10 million. Garfield also heavily believed in American exports to boost the economy. Additionally, Garfield and Blaine believed increasing trade with Latin America would be the best way to keep Great Britain and Ireland from dominating the region. By encouraging exports, they believed they could increase American prosperity, and Garfield authorized Blaine to call for a Pan-American Conference in 1882 to mediate disputes among Latin American nations and to serve as a forum for talks on increasing trade. In this alternate timeline, Garfield would be able to increase trade and ties between the US and Latin American countries to keep Britain and the Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. Garfield would also attempt to make agreements with Korea and Madagascar, but at this time Madagascar will be dealing with the ever-jealous French who were invading. Also, it's possible that Garfield gets the US involved in something with China, but who knows how that would go. Garfield also sought to expand American influence in other areas, calling for the renegotiation of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty to allow the United States to construct a canal through Panama without British involvement and attempting to reduce British influence in the strategically located Kingdom of Hawaii. Garfield and Blaine's plan for American involvement in the world stretched even beyond the Western Hemisphere, as he sought further commercial treaties and ties with Korea and Madagascar, again wanting to export to other countries. Garfield also considered increasing U.S. military strength abroad, asking Navy Secretary Hunt to investigate the Navy's condition with an eye toward expansion and modernization. In the end, these ambitious plans never came to anything more after Garfield's assassination. 9 countries had accepted invitations to the Pan American Conference, but the invitations were withdrawn in April of 1882 after Arthur canceled the conference and Blaine resigned. Naval reform would continue under Arthur on a more modest scale than what Garfield and Hunt had envisioned, ultimately ending the construction of the Squadron of Evolution. In this alternate timeline, however, Garfield's naval dreams are fully enacted, and the U.S. has a fully modern navy in the 1880s. Additionally, the war in the Pacific ends in 1882, as Garfield's Pan America Conference will see Latin American grievances with one another being mediated by the U.S. Furthermore, economic agreements are put in place to maintain peace between many countries. Now the question becomes, with all of this, will there be a second term for Garfield? With this comes the 1884 election, where in our timeline, Grover Cleveland won by 75,000 votes, and in an alternate 1884 elections, Democrats can't really smear Garfield's reputation, as he's already had a pretty successful first term, so I believe that despite the fact that Republicans have won every post-Civil War election so far, Garfield will be getting another term against whoever the Democrats nominate in this timeline. Therefore, Garfield is going to have another 4 years in office and handle everything that Cleveland had to deal with in his first term in our timeline. During this term, the U.S. works on building the Panama Canal with other Latin American countries. Additionally, President Cleveland would help Leopold get the Congo during the scramble for Africa during his term, which is something that Garfield definitely wouldn't do. However, the 1888 election will see a Democrat victory. Potentially Grover Cleveland will win against likely Republican nominee James G. Blaine. But this is just one possible scenario. What do you think would have happened had Garfield lived through his term in office? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.